District of Conservation is sponsored by the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, better known as CFACT. To learn more about our sponsor, head over to cfact.org. Thanks for listening to the program. Welcome to District of Conservation. I am your host, Gabriella Hoffman. This podcast offers a sober examination into all things hunting, fishing, shooting sports, energy, environment, and the public policy surrounding it. And this podcast also specializes in original interviews that you won't hear elsewhere. Here's what I have for you today. Todd, welcome to the podcast. Good to have you.
Thanks so much.
What is your background for those who are unfamiliar, and talk about your work with the Washington Policy Center? If I understand correctly, you got a promotion, new title.
Yeah.
So what do you do? What is of interest in terms of your professional work for my listeners? I think people would like to know that.
Yeah. So for almost 2 decades, I've been the environmental director at the Washington Policy Center here in Washington State, where there's a lot of environmental issues. Environmentalism has become basically intertwined with every issue. If you want to justify something in Washington State, you claim it has an environmental benefit, and that's how you do it. So there's a lot of fights over that. I used to work at the Washington State Department of Natural Resources, sort of at the tail end of the spotted owl fight. Also dealt with old growth forests and forest fires. And so, a lot of those same issues are going on today. I also worked on salmon recovery issues, which is very important to us in the Pacific Northwest. So having done that for nearly 2 decades for the Washington Policy Center, the vice president for research decided it was time to retire. And so I've moved into that role. And so I'll keep doing environmental stuff because that's such a big part of of general policy in Washington State, but also nationally. But yeah, now I get to focus on a lot of other things as well.
That's great. And congratulations again. Why don't we talk about something you wanted to chime in on, and I think my listeners should be aware of because of just how policymaking in states don't like to just stay in particular states. They usually are looked to as models to replicate elsewhere. But Washington Initiative 2117 is something you wanted to touch upon when we were planning to do the podcast. So what is that aiming to do? Because I know it's, I think, to repeal the carbon tax that you guys have there, or rather the carbon trade program, cap and trade program you guys have there. So explain what that is and what the initiative sets to do if the voters are able to, or if the voters decide to undo the cap and trade program.
Yeah. So in 2021, we passed cap and trade for CO2 emissions, very similar to California and what California and Quebec have. In fact, the goal is to join them in this carbon market. So we have a cap on total CO2 emissions that declines to basically zero by 2050. That zero is pretty difficult to get to, but actually what's going to be more difficult is that we have to cut our CO2 emissions by 50% by 2030. And just for context, that we would have to do the equivalent of 4 COVIDs in terms of CO2 reduction between now and 2030 to reach that goal. So it's really a crazy goal. It's very destructive, but we've put a hard cap on it, on CO2 emissions. And if you want to sell gasoline, natural gas, or diesel in the state, you have to get a permit, and there's a limited number of permits. So it's a very standard cap and trade, but the restrictions are very strict. And so last year, 2023 was the first year that we had it. And our prices for permits at auction were 80% higher than California's. So people talk about how crazy California's climate policies are. Our prices were 80% higher than theirs, which pushed Washington's gasoline prices, to the highest in the nation for the first time ever. They have since come down a little bit, but still we're among the top. So you can imagine that people in Washington State were not pleased. So now there is an initiative on the ballot, 2117, that you mentioned, that would repeal it. In addition to just getting rid of a bad, expensive policy, even if you care about climate change, even if you want to reduce CO2 emissions, having a policy that is 80% more expensive than California's is just outrageous. There's lots of other ways that we can reduce CO2 emissions that are much less expensive and much less disruptive. But it also sends a signal. I know that New York State is considering a very similar cap and trade system, and has pointed to Washington State. So if we can repeal cap and trade, this very expensive climate policy in Washington State, it really sends a signal everywhere else that these policies are not welcome.
They haven't resorted to climate culling like that one professor or retired professor has suggested. But I think when people look at carbon taxes or cap and trade program, we have something kind of similar, I think, with RGGI here. And Virginia pulled out successfully from that after our governor assessed it and said that it would hurt not only producers, consumers ultimately. And then Virginia was already on the path in his justification for pullout, already on the downward trajectory, even outside of membership in this kind of cap and trade program too. So you can cut emissions without having to be part of a formalized structure. And the evidence is very clear too. I think it was a Congressional Research Service paper that found that states outside of RGGI, probably very similar to not being in a program like what you guys have in Washington State either, you could still reduce emissions even more effectively without being in such like a system like that or a program like that. So there are a lot of questions about, are those programs really going to be propelling, let's say, individuals or companies or the government to lower emissions? And those results are debatable.
Yeah, and even if they do, right? I mean, if you put a hard cap on the amount of gasoline that you can sell in a state, which functionally that's what we have, right? You can meet your targets. You can meet your CO2 targets if you enforce it. The cost is just going to be astronomical, and you're going to do far more, damage economically than you should, and do far more damage than good for the world. And that, I think, is the issue. So at some level, what they're doing doesn't work because a lot of the money that they're spending, right? They've raised $2 billion in taxes in just 1 year. And now they're lavishing it out to special interest groups and lots of projects. And if you look at these projects, they're not really requirements that they meet CO2 reductions. They just simply say, well, we're going to set it for, we're going to spend it on solar. We're going to spend it on EV charging stations. We're going to, a lot of things that sound good, but in our history haven't worked. One of the things that's so interesting and that I point out all the time is that top-down government programs don't really work very effectively for the environment. Jay Inslee, our governor, actually in 2019 announced he was running for president because he had been such a successful governor on climate and the environment. Now he was going to do that for the country. But his record shows that he's failed basically at everything he's done on the environment. CO2 emissions have gone up every year he's been in office. And every year he's claimed, next year they're going to start to come down because our policies will work. Well, that hasn't worked. And so one of the reasons we have this extremely strict cap and CO2 system is because of their failure. Had we been able to target policies that actually work, that promoted innovation, that promoted energy efficiency, instead of, sort of mindlessly spending money on whatever trendy political thing, the goals wouldn't have to be so radical. But because the governor failed so badly in his first 2 terms, now you have to really, if you want to meet those goals, the policies have to get more strict, more expensive, more destructive. Let me just add one more thing, which is that they say, well, okay, it's very high cost, but because we're leaders, and this is a word that you hear all the time, we're leaders on climate change, clean technology companies will come to Washington State. Well, that's simply not true. The Department of Energy, as part of promoting the expenditures of the IRA, say, look at all the green jobs and here's all the places that they have started. Well, if you look at, the Department of Energy, the Biden administration's own map, a lot of them are in the Southeast United States because the business climate is friendly there. So, businesses, clean energy businesses like anyone else are businesses. And so they're going to go to where there's a friendly business environment. And Washington State has very few, if any, new companies doing this. So it's sort of the worst of both worlds. We pay the high costs, but we don't get any of the job or other benefits.
That's what I think a lot of people look to when they see states like Washington, why they're not attracting more talent or businesses because of just how the economics are structured there. So naturally, of course, even clean energy companies, so to speak, wouldn't even want to go there either. But that's an interesting observation. Relatedly, Todd, we got to meet recently and catch up when you were filming as part of our Conservation Nation report on hydropower. I want you to share with our listeners a little bit into the issue because there's a targeting, of course, a perennial targeting of the 4 lower Snake River dams. And we had met at Ice Harbor, which is a very unique area, interesting kind of backdrop there. And you can see the dam really close, even without having to go behind security. But I want you to share kind of what you spoke about with me and my videographer about this issue. What should people outside of Washington know about dam removal or the so-called Free the Snake movement that's going on, and why you have issues with that?
Well, it's a regional issue, but it is emblematic of what environmental groups do nationwide. And in fact, the Biden administration has made this a priority of their environmental agenda. What's interesting is that the political appointees at NOAA Fisheries in the Biden administration have actually put together a report saying, we need to do something about the impact the dams are causing, and said, the dams are going to come down at some point. We know that. We just have to figure out how. What's so interesting about that is that the political appointees at NOAA have basically overridden the local NOAA folks, whom I know because I worked on salmon recovery with projects with them, and local scientists who have a much more complex understanding. For instance, one of the claims is that if we tear down the Snake River dams, populations of salmon will increase, and Puget Sound orca, which are also endangered, will benefit. Well, NOAA, that was implied in the political appointees report. But the local NOAA folks say, no, that's wrong. It will have no impact on orca. So I tell that story just to indicate that this is, for people who are outside of the Pacific Northwest, why they should care. This is a great example of how the Biden administration and the environmental left takes an issue, makes it their priority, and uses politics and ignores the science. But the fact is that the 4 lower Snake River dams, their impact on salmon runs is very small. And it would cost, by the estimates of the people who want to tear down the dams, about $35 billion to tear down the 4 dams. And the largest ever assessment of the impact of the Snake River dams, which was done by the federal scientific agencies, says that if you destroyed the dams, that it would have a very small, it would increase salmon recovery, but it would have a very small marginal benefit on salmon recovery. And if you keep the dams, salmon would recover anyway. So it is, I think, about as clear example nationwide where sort of the romance of destroying dams and, what I say semi-facetiously of wiping the human stain from the planet is driving this rather than science and good economics. Having worked in salmon recovery in the Pacific Northwest, I can tell you, if you gave me $35 billion, I could tell you lots of things that we could do that would have a far better, more important impact on salmon recovery than destroying these dams. But because it's not nearly as sexy, that's not what people focus on.
So what is imperiling the salmon? You had talked about this with us. It's not the dams. What other extraneous or what other factors can be pointed to the plight of the salmon? It's a very interesting response you gave me. So I think you should share a little bit of what you had told us on camera with that. I think people would be surprised and hard pressed to learn that it's not actually the structures that they're intending to go after.
Yeah, the dams do have a small impact, but again, it's relatively small. There are some much bigger impacts. One of the big impacts is ocean conditions. We don't control, we don't know much about what happens in ocean conditions, but we can detect very clearly that ocean conditions, whether it's warm and where the salmon go in the ocean, makes a big difference about their rates of return. We know that because the rates of return for salmon from when they go out to when they come back and spawn 4 or 5 years later is low across the Pacific Northwest, including places that don't have dams. So something is going on that has nothing to do with particular dams. But another one is simply seals and sea lions. There are seals and sea lions at the mouth of the Columbia and also in the Puget Sound that eat a lot of salmon. And in fact, the Washington Academy of Sciences put out a report last year that said that the population of seals and sea lions is actually higher now than it was pre-settlement 300 years ago. That's remarkable. There aren't many animals where their population is higher today than it was 300 years ago. But for seals and sea lions, that's true because tribes hunted them. And so now we have this very big population that they say that like I said, the Washington Academy of Sciences says very clearly is having a big impact on salmon recovery, not just on the Snake River, but in Puget Sound and elsewhere where there aren't dams. So that's that. There's harvest is a little bit, harvest rates have come down. So it's, commercial and sport fishers are not having the impact that they certainly once had. The loss of habitat is another one. There is no silver bullet. And I think that's the fundamental problem with the fixation on the Snake River dams is that it is an effort to look for a silver bullet solution. And spending $35 billion trying to find a silver bullet that doesn't exist is just a complete, it's not just a waste of taxpayer money, it's a waste of opportunity to do things that actually would help salmon. And so it's environmentally irresponsible, not just fiscally irresponsible.
And a little bit differently from, I think, the Klamath Dam, these 4 lower Snake River dams, they're so far protected under Congress's kind of purview. It's not very, the opponents of the dams would love to get rid of them, but it's a little more difficult for dam removal to proceed here. Is that correct?
Yes. They're enormous. The key thing about the Snake River dams, which I don't think we've mentioned, is that they generate a lot of electricity, about 8% of Washington's electricity in total. That is just slightly less than all of the wind and solar combined in Washington state. So imagine if I said, you know what we need to do? We need to tear down every wind turbine and every solar panel in Washington state. You could imagine that the environmental left would lose their minds. And yet that's what we're talking about, not just in terms of energy, but in terms of carbon-free energy in Washington state. So tearing those dams down, it's not just a cost to actually tear them down. It is a cost in all of the other benefits that you get: electricity, navigation down the river. Navigation would essentially be impossible down the river without those dams, and some other benefits like irrigation. So those costs are enormous.
Anything else you want to add about dams before I pick your brain about some other topics?
Yeah, which, I think that it is important to recognize that it took us a long time to get where we are on salmon populations. Salmon populations are low. We do need to do things to help salmon recover in the same way that there are a lot of other species that we have that we need to do those sorts of things. And there are dams. I actually, as a member of the Puget Sound Salmon Recovery Council, voted to spend taxpayer money to remove a dam on the Nooksack River because it truly was having a serious impact. But that's not true everywhere. And there are dams that we have torn down, such as the 2 Elwha dams on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state, where they promised that after 5 years, salmon would recover, and they still haven't. The populations are basically, of Chinook salmon at least, are basically the same. So, like I said, people see this as a silver bullet. They get enamored with the idea of blowing things up and removing these giant human structures and letting nature recover. But it's I think that's a lot of romanticism and hubris, and oftentimes the science simply doesn't support it. Certainly the economics don't.
There's a lot of policy being handed down. And as we're talking, we're approaching a lot of rule finalizations, especially as it hits the Congressional Review Act. Energy is actually, I think, going to be an interesting top of mind issue for people. I mean, inflation is obviously one of the top and some other issues, but I think inflation has a lot to do with energy, with just how much these policies are, I would say, stressing American people's pocketbooks, leading to higher utility bills, the Biden administration policies. So is there anything you would like to see, how should conservatives respond to what is happening, let's say, as it goes into the election cycle? What does good policy from the right look like to you?
Well, I think primarily it looks like local control. I mean, I think that the problem that we have in energy and environment generally is a lot of top-down planning, a lot of sense that we can impose these rules and trust us, it'll all work out in the end. And so what's interesting now is that you see a lot on the left complaining about NEPA. And here in Washington State, we have a similar called SEPA, which is the environmental review process. And you hear people on the environmental left complaining because those rules are getting in their way of building what they want to build, because they have this very all-encompassing view of how to plan our energy future. We've seen a hint of that in California, right? They're already having energy shortages. Their electricity costs have gone up radically. So that's, I think, the challenge. So the closer you can get to people controlling, energy and environmental issues, the more likely you are to get better outcomes, because people who feel the costs of their decisions make better decisions. And one of the frustrations that I have, especially with electricity, is if you ask somebody, what gas prices are, they can tell you, almost to the penny in many cases. If you ask somebody what they pay per kilowatt hour, they won't even know what a kilowatt hour is, let alone, what they pay. And I think that lack of transparency gives politicians a lot of leeway to do a lot of damage, a lot of mischief. And I know that's the case because here in Washington State, when the tax on CO2 emissions was put in place, the Utilities Commission on the natural gas heating side actually banned the utility from listing the cost of the CO2 tax on people's bills. They like transparency. And so I think, the more that we can put power in the hands of individuals, the more transparent we can be about the cost of electricity, the less politicians and other folks who impose these very costly rules can get away with blaming it. And you've seen it, Gabriella, right? I mean, when, we now have the, government policies that have caused inflation. And their reaction, the Biden administration's reaction was, oh, no, this is, transitory. And now they've come up with shrinkflation because they need to blame everyone but themselves. We see the same things with environmental policies. Politicians impose these rules. They make energy more expensive, less reliable. But because the costs are not transparent, they get away with blaming big oil or utilities or whomever else for the the predictable results of their own policies. So just from a theoretical standpoint, more local control and more transparency, I think would go a long way to helping show the cost of these bad ideas.
Anything else on your mind that you'd like to add as we round up the conversation about anything on your mind? Because there's a lot, it's so hard to keep track of everything, but I'll let you have the floor to dispense on anything else you want to add.
No, it's great. One of the things that I will say is that I think, having worked in environmental policy for 25 years, when I first got into it, I had a very traditional conservative approach to environment, which is that it's a trade-off between the environment and economic prosperity and things like that. And I sort of fell into the trap of believing, the left's policies work, they just cost too much. What I have learned in 25 years is no, the left's policies don't work. That the reason that we still have so many, endangered species that are listed that they don't, get delisted, The reason that Washington State, despite having a governor who has made climate change his number one priority, the reason CO2 emissions have gone up every year of his administration, the reason that so many of his policies have failed is that their policy, their approach doesn't work, and they care more about image than results. And so for a lot of conservatives, the admonition that I have is stop sounding like you don't care about the environment. I understand why they do that, because they think that the left's policies are a Trojan horse for socialism. Because they are. They openly say that. So I get the skepticism and I share it. But that doesn't mean that we don't get to say we're the ones who care about the environment. We're the ones whose policies actually work and engage people on the ground. And that's, I think, that simple change in how we approach environmental issues makes such a big difference. As you know, Gabriella, hunters are some of the biggest contributors to habitat protection and restoration projects because they want to hand hunting down to their children, and they want to make sure that there are deer, elk, ducks, and other things in the future. And so they voluntarily pay to do those sorts of things. That's the conservation ethic. That is the spirit of conservative approach to the environment, rather than this top-down, heavy-handed government. And in my book, which I released a year and a half ago, called Time to Think Small, it is an argument for thinking small, thinking on the ground, empowering people, not big government. Think small, not big, to help the environment. And it's not just that it does more for prosperity or freedom. It does, but it also does more for the environment. And so that's the one thing I always try to tell conservatives is stop being defensive about the environment and start telling the left, no, your policies don't work, ours do. I can tell you from being in a state that is where I'm surrounded by left-wing environmentalists, when you point that out to them, they hate it. So even if you just want to stop an annoying environmental leftists from harassing you, telling them that your policies work and their don't is one of the best ways to get back at them. It also happens to have the benefit of being true.
I had that same hesitation because I always thought it was a leftist issue when I was in college, and you were inundated by like the Clinton Global Initiative, and you couldn't have a conservative say. So that's why I always say the tagline, conservation is conservative. And I wasn't the first to coin it, I don't think, but I've maybe contributed a little bit to its popularity. You see governors and others using it because it rolls off the tongue. And I think going on the offensive by saying that, and that's how you news make or effectuate on, environmental issues. I have seen anecdotally in my different university speeches to students, largely conservative audiences, they like the term conservation. And so if we use the right terms, the term environmentalism can kind of turn off people. But if they hear like conservation or classical environmentalism or stewardship, those words tend to be a little better. So I think we are making headway in our political space, in our political movement, I think, with talking more positively, and how you don't necessarily have to be like pro-development all the time, but you could also be for true sustainability and true conservation, and have a balance of those two ideas. They're not at odds with one another. They actually work very much in concert with one another. So I totally agree there. And I think we are starting to see people gravitate towards speaking offensively, positively about environmentalism, and kind of reclaim conservation from the left a lot of the times, because they've hijacked the term to mean no uses instead of wise natural resource management. So it's important to take back that term. And I even think like independents and moderates and even some center leftists are like, yeah, we know the term conservation has been bungled by a lot of people on the far left, the preservationists. So I think conservatives can help work together with those who are interested to take back that term and actually showcase what true conservation is, without being, in support of. I don't think anyone is in support of anymore develop like a Walmart in every corner, or put billboards in national parks, or privatize all lands. I think those are very minority opinions. When it comes to people on the right having that, sometimes some people propose asinine stuff like the Return Act to get rid of Pittman-Robertson, which makes no sense to do that under Second Amendment stuff, which is beyond our conversation. But I think the center right is learning how to speak about conservation. So I'm a little hopeful with that. And it takes individuals like you, me, and many of people I work with to kind of news make and to showcase like what a positive vision of conservation environmentalism is. It just takes a little bit of individual effort to do that. And I think it is catching on where people are like, we're not going to cede this issue to the left anymore. So I like seeing that change, but I think a lot of us have been previously timid. So I just wanted to put that there. So Todd, where can everyone follow you, learn about your musings, read your work, see your efforts? Please dispense the links for people to connect with you.
Yeah. So as I said, I'm the VP of Research at the Washington Policy Center, Washington State. So you can go to washingtonpolicy.org. You can find me on Twitter at WAPolicyGreen. I talk mostly about Washington State issues for obvious reasons, but we fight the battles here first before they come to a lot of other places. And so you can see what's coming down the road. And again, you can hopefully see how we have over time learned how to fight back against the left's bad ideas by pointing out that their policies don't work and that there are superior ways to be good stewards of the planet. For God's sakes, look at a map. Look at where conservatives live. They live near nature, not the left. So that's what you'll find in my work at the Policy Center.
Wonderful. It has been great catching up with you, Todd. I know people will take away your musings and look to see what's happening in Washington and hope that it doesn't replicate in their state. So really appreciate you coming on, and let's do this again sometime soon.
Absolutely. Very nice to chat with you.
Thanks for listening to District of Conservation. If you enjoyed what you heard today, go leave us some reviews on Apple and Spotify or wherever podcasts are played. Your feedback will help us reach more people, and I love to know what is on your mind after each episode. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to never miss a beat or a guest announcement, because that is our way of updating all of you listeners, and we have just hit 1,000 followers on Instagram for the podcast account. Thank you very much. And if you have any guest suggestions or topics you want to hear on the show, I am all ears. I would love to hear your feedback there. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for the next episode.